Hi, you're listening to the Full Stack Educator Podcast.
We provide relevant resources to new and aspiring independent school leaders to help you grow, succeed at work, and have a positive impact on the lives of students.
I'm Michael.
And I'm Matt.
On this podcast, we have insightful conversations with leaders from across all areas of independent school education. Today's guest is Mark Mitchell. Mark joined NAIS in 1998 and supports K-12 schools and other organizations in the effective administration of financial aid programs to improve the accessibility, affordability, and socioeconomic diversity of independent schools. He has authored several articles, book chapters, and blogs, and also frequently presents at workshops, conferences, and schools on tuition pricing and affordability, demographic and income trends, socioeconomic diversity and inclusion, and school financial aid policy and procedures. Mark is also a member of the NAIS Strategy Lab team, delivering research and training for schools on building innovation cultures and the capacity to tackle key challenges and leverage opportunities. Mark is an alumnus and past trustee of Morristown Friends School in New Jersey, is currently a trustee of the Enrollment Management Association, and is a member of the advisory board for the National Partnership of Educational Access. Mark earned his Bachelor of Science in Communication Studies from Northwestern University. Here is our conversation with Mark Mitchell. Hi, Mark. Thank you so much for speaking with us today and being on the Full Stack Educator Podcast. Our listeners are new and aspiring independent school leaders. And so we like to ask all our guests to start off by just telling us a little bit about their journey within education and leadership. Could you tell us a bit about your journey?
Yeah, absolutely. And first of all, let me just say thank you for having me on and appreciate the opportunity to talk a little bit about these things with anybody who's willing to listen. So thank you for the opportunity. So my journey at the National Association of Independent Schools has kind of been actually in about four different sort of phases, 4 or 5 kind of phases. I've been at NAIS for a long time, since 1998. And I've had sort of like I said, like 4 or 5 different iterations of my job there. And the one pull throughout all those iterations has been helping schools think about and manage financial aid programs and affordability strategies, tuition pricing. But there's been some sort of changes and morphing along the way. So when I first started at NAIS, I came from a higher ed background. For about 10 years, I worked in the higher ed financial aid space at Northwestern University, Lake Forest College out in the Midwest, and I worked for a student loan company. So when I came to NAIS, I was hired as Director of Financial Aid Services. At the time, I was a team of one who was in charge of managing a financial aid service that we owned at the time called the School and Student Service for Financial Aid. We had a relationship with a vendor, Educational Testing Service, or ETS. And so my main role was to sort of oversee the relationship with ETS and make sure that our financial aid service was providing the tools, training, calculations, and research that schools needed to make good financial aid decisions. So I did a lot of work on delivering workshops on financial aid decision-making, best practices, policy and procedures, a lot of the nitty-gritty day-to-day tactical issues. Then some years in, NAIS did a reorganization. And one of the elements of that was that I ended up adding on to that plate, managing our information and research team. And so I was also now responsible for a lot of the NAIS data collection from our member schools and then turning that data into resources and services for schools who are seeking data on everything from enrollment to salaries to fundraising, everything that NAIS typically does collect data on annually. And then during the time that I was in that role was when we moved from a paper data collection process to a digital one, an online one. And so I did that for a few years. And after a while, it was kind of, it was recognized that it was just too much under one umbrella to kind of manage those two big operations. So I went back to just managing the financial aid service after doing that for about 3 or 4 years. But I retained like a big tie, a big connection to the research side of the house because, as we'll talk about a little later, I'm sure, like understanding the data and the trends and doing those analyses was really important to a lot of the work around financial aid and affordability. So still have a very strong tie to the research side of the house. Fast forward a little bit, and then NAIS decided that financial aid business was becoming so competitive, and it was growing in so many different ways that we needed to change the way it was run within the organization. So instead of treating it kind of like a program of the organization, it was sort of reimagined to be almost like a spin-off subsidiary division of NAIS, so that it could run more like a business. Standalone business instead of as a kind of a program that one or two people were managing. And so in that zone, we hired a CEO for that division, and I served as a VP for that division, again, sort of keeping my focus on the professional development, the training aspects, and the research component of the financial aid side of the house. And so that was a whole nother another sort of iteration of working on these issues from that kind of point of view. And during that time, we launched one of our more successful programs, which was our Sss Financial Aid Conference, which we ran for about 4 or 5 years, that brought hundreds of practitioners from around the country together to share ideas in a conference format that was different than different in a way that people were used to kind of gathering around the financial aid topic. So we were in that mode for about 5 or 6 years or so. And then my most recent iteration has been that about 3 or 4 years ago, NAIS actually sold the SSS program to another company called Community Brands. And at the time, a lot of the people who were working on the SSS program moved over to become Community Brands employees, except for me. I stayed under the NAIS umbrella. But my role sort of morphed a little bit away from sort of helping schools with the day-to-day practical and tactical side of managing financial aid, and really becoming more focused on helping school heads and boards and other school leaders think about more of the strategic issues related to financial aid and related to pricing and affordability, socioeconomic diversity. So in the last couple of years, my role has been really more, I should say the last few years, my role has been really more about how to make sure heads and boards and leadership teams are thinking about financial aid in a strategic way, providing workshops, trainings, again, but not so much on how do you make a good financial aid decision for an applicant, but more about how do you know your school's got the right price? How do you know you have the right discounting strategy to stay full? How do you know that that your financial aid budgets are fully and sustainably funded, things like that. And then, of course, in addition to that, in the last couple of years, I've also been part of a team within NAIS that is called the Strategy Lab team. And our Strategy Lab team is actually fairly new, but it's responsible for creating forums and research and resources to help schools think about how to build innovation capacity within their schools, not just around financial aid, but around for anything. So I've been part of that team to deliver workshops and frameworks and just a lot of learning about how do schools that do innovation well, like how do they do that, and what can other schools learn from that? So it's been interesting actually to see how both the financial aid strategy, the strategic thinking in financial aid intersects with innovation. And how schools can be innovative about financial aid strategy. So long way around your question, but that's kind of my journey at NAIS over the past 20 plus years. There's been a few iterations, but always focused on what schools can do to be better at making sure they're as affordable as possible to as many families that need the opportunities that they have.
Yeah. Wow. Mark, there's a lot there. That's so. Just to recap a little bit, you came from higher ed into NAIS and independent schoolwork, and in your earlier days, am I correct? And you were involved in implementing Dazzle, what we would now call Dazzle. Is that right?
I was involved in the precursor. So the first iteration of today's Dazzle, we called it Stats Online back then. And that evolved when I was part of that information and research team. Yep.
Fantastic. And then and I joke because I mean that's a resource that literally schools use every day. I mean that's incredible. Moving on down the line, you were also involved in the development of SSS, which is the primary software. Software is probably not the right word, but the primary service that we use to establish financial aid practices.
So I have to say I was not involved in the development of it. So it was there when I got to NAIS. NAIS had it for a while. But I will say that I was involved in, similar to the Stats and Dazzle thing, I was involved in the phase that really moved the SSS program from a paper-based service to an online, online-based service as well. So it was already in place when I got to NAIS, but with the help of a ton of people, like moving it and keeping it relevant and moving it online was definitely part of my experience.
Yeah. Just to circle back, can you tell us a little bit? Let's jump. Prior to NAIS, what led you into working in higher ed? I mean, what was your journey kind of before those days?
Yeah. So one of the funny things about being a financial aid professional is that no one starts out thinking that that's what they're going to be. So I went to college at Northwestern University. I have a degree in communication studies. And so when I graduated, I didn't have a job. I was trying to find jobs in marketing and PR and couldn't. And so I got to this point where I was like, I just need to have something so I can pay my rent and not have to move away from Chicago. And so I just took a job in the financial aid office as a peer counselor, the undergraduate financial aid office at Northwestern. My first job was as a peer counselor. And that's how I started working in financial aid at higher ed. Was at Northwestern for about 4 or 5 years or so. Then I moved to Lake Forest College as an assistant director of financial aid. And then from there, I worked for a student loan company that did education financing for graduate professional school students. So that's kind of how I ended up in the financial aid space. Now, I will say one of the funny stories, at least for me, for my own personal history, is that when I remember one of the very first days when I started working as the peer counselor at Northwestern, I remember I just graduated from that school. And so one of the first things I did was pull my own financial aid folder. I found my own financial aid records. So I could just kind of see, like, how did they give me aid? How does this work? And I just remember seeing that at the time, my mom, I grew up in a single mom household, very low income family, 2 older brothers. And so I remember looking at my mom's tax returns in my financial aid files and see that she was earning, the time I graduated from college, she was earning about the same amount of money that I was making in my first job out of college, maybe just like a few $1,000s difference. And it wasn't a high number, right? It was like 25 grand. Right. And so I just remember that being like this moment of like, oh my gosh, what kind of sacrifice, right? That my mom did. How did she pull this off? Like, and it was like, well, in part because of her commitment and dedication to me personally, but also in large part to people like the college and others, university that gave us the financial aid to make it a reality. And it was like, from that point on, I was just like, holy smokes, I got to help kids, schools help kids do this stuff the way so many helped me. And then before that, I went to an independent school for a high school, Morristown Friends School in New Jersey, and got a lot of financial aid to help make that happen too. So between like looking at that, what Northwestern did for us to help us pay for and afford it, what Morristown Friends helped to pay, all that stuff just helped me on this trajectory that I thought, if I have a role to play in helping other independent schools put other kids on that same trajectory, that's good stuff to be involved in.
Mark, you mentioned one thing that I'd love to ask about. I have not heard of the Innovation Lab that you had mentioned. Could you just quickly just say something about that? That sounded fascinating.
Yeah, it's called Strategy Lab. Yeah.
Strategy Lab.
And so it is centered around innovation. So Strategy Lab basically is right now, it primarily takes the form of a 3-day workshop that school teams come to, and the schools can determine who they want to bring to their teams, usually about 5 or 6 people on a team. And they come for a 3-day experience where we ask them to bring a key challenge or an opportunity that's in front of them that they're having a hard time making progress on. And in the course of the 3-day experience at Strategy Lab, their team goes through a series of presentations with some content, but mostly structured and framework-driven discussions that allow them to take like these big, huge ideas, opportunities or challenges, and kind of whittle them down into actionable, sort of like prototypes of projects or initiatives that they can go try. And so Strategy Lab really tries to give them tools and frameworks that they can use, not just during that workshop, but they can go back to their schools and use those same tools and frameworks over and over again whenever they have big opportunities or big challenges in front of them that they need to break down into manageable prototypes for projects. So one of the things that sort of yielded that, one of the things that we did that led to the creation of that lab was we had done some research on why parents choose to send their children to independent schools. And one of the concerns or considerations we had as a team at NAIS was, well, we can just kind of like spit out another white paper or like a research report and kind of like put it out there for people to read and do whatever they want with it. And then we thought, well, no, how can we make this more actionable? Like, what can we do to sort of take the lessons learned from here and turn them into action steps that schools can actually do something with? So it doesn't just sit on the shelf, a real or virtual shelf, and kind of not get traction. So we designed this lab to kind of figure out how can we help schools take the lessons from that research and turn them into things to do that can impact your demand curve, basically impact how satisfied families are with your school, how you can leverage the creativity and the intellectual capacity you have within like your faculty, your staff. How can you look at rethinking even how you market or communicate or promote yourself around some of these research points? And so that's kind of how Strategy Lab was born. It was born out of the idea of, how do we help schools find actionable insights from research, and what tools and frameworks can we give them to move them along that continuum?
That sounds very cool. I'm very much a strategy guy myself. I love data and problem solving frameworks. That sounds like a really great opportunity and resource for folks.
It really is. Yeah, we've been doing Strategy Lab now for 3 years or so. The first year was total prototype, just try it and see how it goes. And in this time, we've had about 100 schools come through the various labs that we have put together. And this past year, of course, we did our labs virtually. We're going to do them virtually this year as well. And so it's been interesting to see how we had to pivot in the COVID days, like everybody else has had to still deliver that, but in a totally online format. So it's been great. We've had a lot of schools come through, and they've all found it to be very, very helpful in different ways.
All right, so we're going to pivot just a little bit. Like I mentioned at the start, a lot of our listeners, most of our listeners are new and aspiring independent school leaders. And unless they've had the opportunity to work directly with admissions and enrollment, they might not have a really clear understanding of how admissions and enrollment works. And so I'm curious if you could provide us with just a basic framework for an admissions office and how one operates.
Sure. Yeah, that's a good question. In this, I guess I'd start by acknowledging that the tactical side of admissions work is actually just one component of the overall or a larger discipline, so to speak, of enrollment management. There are several components that make a good enrollment management strategy, and admissions work is just one of those components. And so in simplest of terms, I think the admissions office, I would say, is responsible for bringing in the new students into the available seats that a school has each year. And so some of the core operational functions of that office includes, coordinating marketing and outreach to spread the word about the school throughout the different communities that they're trying to draw students from. This includes advertising, social media campaigns, website management, things like that. They organize events and touch points with parents and students to generate the interest in the school and to showcase the school. So this is where you see things like open houses, visit days for prospective students. All that stuff's managed by admissions professionals. They collect, manage, and vet applications. So, interested students fill out these forms, tell us about yourself, give us your test scores and recommendations and all that stuff. Do some interviews so that the committees who have the say in who gets accepted into the school have the information that they need to make those decisions. So in a typical school, the admissions director does not, he or she, him or herself does not make the admissions decision. Is almost always or usually made by a committee that often includes some faculty members, perhaps some coaches, perhaps some other admins, to basically decide who they'll make those offers to. But the director of admissions coordinates and oversees that whole process. And then, of course, once those decisions are made, then the admissions office is responsible for communicating those decisions to families, answering questions, managing enrollment contracts and receipts, and the commitments from families on the time schedule that the school needs to know that stuff by. And so they do a lot to sort of manage the enrollment process itself, like actually getting those new students to be enrolled in the school. And then I'd say, another big area is the study of data on admissions activity, on demand for the school, reporting to the head of the school, and very often to the board on key trends or issues or challenges, successes that they have in their work, so that they can sort of make sure they're always improving the strategies and the processes that they have in place to keep that funnel filled with the prospects that they need. And so those are kind of like the main categories of the tactical work, I think, of the admissions office. We know most schools tend to have, I shouldn't say most schools, a typical school tends to have a fairly small staff of team to do that work, maybe 3-4 people or so. Some of the big boarding schools might have larger staffs, especially if they have to recruit or when they recruit internationally quite a bit. You might see some boarding schools with staffs of 8 to 10 folks. But in a typical day school, it might be around 3 or 4, maybe 6, 7 people, probably on the top end. So they usually tend to be pretty lean operations in terms of staffing. I should also mention that in about half of the schools, some of our data suggests that in about half of the schools, the admissions office is also responsible for managing the financial aid process as well. In about a third of the schools, that's managed by the business office, and then the rest, the other 15 or so percent, is managed by either somebody in the head's office or some other. But typically, admissions staff also manage financial aid, the financial aid process as well.
Yeah, speaking of financial aid, can you kind of give us, in a nutshell, how does financial aid work, and what's changed over the last 10, 20 years for financial aid?
Yeah, so financial aid work is definitely more complicated and more complex than it used to be. But in general, financial aid works. How it works is that financial aid is a tool that a lot of schools use to to lower the school's published price to enable or entice a family to enroll in the school. Right, in its essence, that's what it is. But it can take a lot of different forms. financial aid, depending on who you're talking to, can be defined in different ways or can mean different things. And so basically there are about 4 different sort of categories that financial aid kind of tends to fall into. One is need-based financial aid, which requires families to demonstrate through applications and other things, demonstrate that they cannot afford to pay the full price. That you demonstrate that you have need for assistance in order for your child to be able to enroll. So that's a big chunk of schools. We find in our member schools that about, 85, 90%, probably maybe even a little more, of all the financial aid that's offered comes in the form of need-based financial aid. Families have to show need, and we'll talk a little bit about that later, how they do that. But another type is what I consider to be benefits-based financial aid. And in schools, this typically takes the form of tuition remission, right? Typically based on years of service or this employment status you have in a particular school. But it doesn't mean you necessarily have to show need. It's like, you're a teacher here, you can have 70% discount off of our tuition or 100% discount. And so that's a tuition remission. That tuition remission program is a benefits-based financial aid type of support. Then there's also merit-based financial aid. And the merit-based financial aid basically is offered to students who show extraordinary talent or skill, some accomplishments that they've had, or even the potential to be great at something or another. Which may, whether or not they demonstrate they have financial needs. So many schools, not most, but many schools, about 35-40% of schools report to NAIS that they offer merit-based financial aid as well. And a lot of times merit-based is offered to really help entice families who do feel like their child has some special abilities or character or strengths that the school wants to have in their enrollment pool. Merit aid, like I said, about 35-40% of schools say they offer it. Merit aid kind of makes up about a little less than 10% of all the financial aid that independent NAIS schools give out. So it's not a huge amount of financial aid, but it's growing. More and more schools are using merit in ways, but it's still fairly limited, especially compared to the expansiveness of need-based aid. And then I would say the 4th bucket is what I would just kind of call, for lack of a better word, this is not very precise, but for lack of a better word, just sort of like price discounts. And so this is usually like price reductions that are based on specific conditions or characteristics, like sibling discounts is a major one. If the family has 2 or 3 or 4 children enrolled, the school may give them 5 or 10% discount because they have a multiple tuition burden that they're trying to make it a little bit easier. Some schools are starting to do like loyalty discounts. It's still kind of rare, but if you've been in our school, we're K-12, you've been in our school for 8 years, starting in year 9, you might get 10%, discount off of the year 9 price and things like that. So those are other types of financial aid that are not based on need, not based on merit, but just based on sort of enticements, more or less. So usually when somebody does say the phrase financial aid, though, just from a parlance perspective, they usually are talking about need-based aid. So sometimes it's important to clarify.
Yeah, got it. I was just thinking like an alumni scholarship, a child of an alumni, that would fall in that 4th bucket.
Yeah, depending on how they structure it. So if it's just like it could be an alumni discount, or they could have a merit-based scholarship that's only available to alums, right? Children of alums. So sometimes they can cross some categories, depending on how they're actually structured. But absolutely, that could happen.
So this is getting technical, but I know this was kind of difficult for me to wrap my head around. Can you talk a little bit about the difference between what I would call a funded scholarship and other forms of financial aid? Because well, I mean, they all get paid for eventually, but
this is good. So funded basically means that, so let's say you apply for financial aid and it's determined that you are eligible to receive $10,000 that you can't pay. You can pay all but $10,000. So you have demonstrated a need for $10,000. How that $10,000 gets sort of accounted for in the school's books could be one of two ways. So a funded scholarship or a funded grant would be, they would take the $10,000 from some other source that's been generated to kick off that $10,000 of income, so that instead of you paying that $10,000 of income, somebody else has prepaid that for you, in a nutshell. So this usually takes the form of like endowed scholarships. So I might give your school $1 million and say, I want the income from this $1 million to go to students like Matt, right? And that my $1 million endowment may kick off $100,000 in a year. And so the school can take that $100,000 and fund 10 Matts who need $10,000. And so that's a funded grant, right? So because they have a fund that provides that income that you can't pay yourself. And an unfunded means that we have figured out in our budget process that based on what we believe the tuition revenue will generate, based on our expenses and other revenue sources that we have, like endowment income or interest income from our investments, et cetera, that we can actually afford to forego 15% of our gross tuition that we would generate if everybody paid full tuition. So instead of expecting $10 million of tuition, we're actually going to expect $8.5 million. And that difference is unfunded financial aid, basically. So that $1.5 million difference is the amount that we are willing to not collect in order to bring that price down for people who can't pay our full price and still enroll them. And so if you got a $10,000 grant that was unfunded, that means that it was basically just an offset, an expected offset against the tuition revenue we planned to not expect to collect in the first place. And so unfunded basically is just sort of like, we expect that we're going to just not collect X percentage of our tuition revenue, gross tuition revenue, or X number of dollars of our tuition revenue. But we're not seeking for that money to come from somebody else in order to meet that gap that you can't, but which is what a funded program does. And so most schools typically fund their financial aid programs through unfunded means. Most schools will say, we can afford to forego, because of either how we structure our expense side of the budget or how we structure other revenue streams that we can use. We can afford to forego a certain amount of our tuition collection. And so when we're looking at who qualifies for financial aid, one of the tricks and roles and responsibilities of a financial aid director is to make sure that the funds that they're distributing are allocated in a way that kind of stays as close to that unfunded box, so to speak, as they can. And so it becomes it can become a challenging exercise, especially when the demand for those funds exceeds the amount of dollars that are available. Because if you overspend the unfunded budget too much, that means you're at the risk of not generating even the lower amount of net tuition revenue that the school is expecting to use to fund its operations. And so striking that balance is really critical. I hope that was a useful, even if long-winded, way to explain the difference.
Absolutely. And correct me if I'm wrong. I mean, this isn't something that independent schools have invented. This is something that higher ed does every day, right?
Absolutely. Yeah.
That's common practice.
It is common practice. I will say, though, that one of the big differences between independent school and higher ed financial aid, there are a lot, but one of the big ones is the sources of funding for financial aid. So in higher ed, you're much, much more likely to see a broader variety of funded financial aid programs, whether the scholarships or support from state and federal governments. That just at the independent school level doesn't exist nearly to the same depth or breadth. And so a lot of the strategies that independent schools have around increasing affordability for families is the biggest lever really is unfunded financial aid. There are very few schools that have like fully funded financial aid programs. There are a few, but very few. You have to have like super high endowments, and you have to have super I guess super disciplined controls in terms of like financial model to be able to kind of keep the funding available through those funded means to be effectively stretched. So very few schools actually have highly funded financial aid programs. Most of them are unfunded.
Yeah, now it's great to make that distinction. And as you just said, that's the lever that schools can pull. So let's talk a little bit about where the rubber meets the road. Why we do this? How does the admissions office or the enrollment management process balance different goals? I mean, the primary goal is obviously we don't want empty seats in our classrooms, but then we don't want all the same kid, right? How does that work?
Yeah, that's also very tricky at a lot of places. So one of the things that I talk about to schools all the time, whether it's a group of practitioners or a board of trustees, is that before any school or any school administrator makes their first financial aid decision of a season, that they have to be very clear for that season and for that year what its primary purpose of the financial aid spending is going to be. And so one of the ways to kind of best address tackling those competing priorities is to have a clear point of view on what's most important to you. And this is a big part of the work of the board. It's sort of like if the board was like, we're going to spend whatever, I don't know, $5 million to build a building. Like they usually don't come to that decision without knowing exactly what they're building that building for, who it's supposed to serve, what kind of programs are supposed to be run out of it. And they have that clarity, right? So you're not going to spend $5 million thinking you're going to build a gymnasium and then you get surprised that you've actually built a dining hall, right? That doesn't happen. And financial aid should work the same way because typical independent school spends, over $1 million, close to $2 million. And many schools spend well over $8, $9, $10 million just on financial aid spending. And if you're not clear whether or not you want those dollars to bring socioeconomic diversity, do you want it to just kind of, like you said, fill seats? Do you want it to recognize merit and talent? Do you want it to, open the doors of access and opportunity for the most needy, students in your community? Like all those things are goals. And most schools will tell you that they have all of those goals in mind when they're looking at their financial aid strategy. And so it's important in order to help reconcile competing priorities. It's important to know what's our primary priority, what's our primary purpose, and then make sure that the person who's making those financial aid decisions has the same answer to that question as the head of school and as the finance committee chair on the board, et cetera, so that everybody's on the same page in terms of what you're going to, because, deciding how to use limited financial aid dollars amidst those competing priorities and amidst that sort of what we're seeing as a growing demand for financial aid can actually be difficult for a financial aid administrator to kind of know, like, who should I be awarding? So let's say like you got 50 grand left to spend in your financial aid budget, right? And you've got two kids who both need $25,000 of financial aid. But you've also got 10 kids who need $5,000 each of financial aid. So you can spend that last $50,000, one way or the other, right? I could use it to get both of these highest need kids an award, or I could get like 10 kids who all need a little bit in. And so like, how do I decide that, right? Part of that is knowing that, well, guess what? If our primary purpose is to extend access and opportunity, it makes it easier for me to see how and why I need to give that money to the two $25,000 students. If our primary goal is to fill more seats and generate more tuition revenue, it makes it easier for me to see that I need to give that $50,000 to the 10 kids who each need $5,000. And without that clarity, making that decision becomes more complicated. Now, the other thing about that is, and this is the last thing I'll say about it, the other thing about that is that whichever of those decisions you have to make, you're trading off something else, right? So if I give it to the 10 $5,000 kids, I'm trading off the goal of the goal of widening access and opportunity for the goal of filling more seats and generating more revenue. If I offer to the two $25,000 kids, I'm trading off the goal of filling more seats, right? I'm going to fill fewer seats. And so it depends, like which way you go on that depends on like a bunch of different combination of factors that the financial aid committee or director needs to weigh out and balance out. But acknowledging that in most cases, there's usually like a push-pull or some trade-offs that have to happen. It's something that I always tell financial aid directors that when you get to talk to the head of school or the board about your financial aid challenges, always keep in mind, like, what are those trade-offs that limited funding or unclear priorities kind of end up pulling you towards. So, and then another thing about how to manage those competing priorities is sometimes we talked earlier about funded versus unfunded aid. Sometimes it can be helpful where you can address those competing priorities simultaneously if you are able to or strategically able to manage different funding streams to sort of accommodate those different needs. So you may have donors who might be more interested in seeing socioeconomic diversity happen at your campus, right? And so they might be willing to fund specific scholarships or specific amounts of need-based aid that go towards that purpose. So the $50,000 I need to get those two kids that need $25,000. Well, if that's a funded program, then that frees me up to use my unfunded dollars to go after some other priority that perhaps I wouldn't be as successful raising money for. And so sometimes you can address those different priorities through philanthropy or other kinds of ways to kind of look at how can we use other revenue streams to fund specific priorities.
It sounds like this is a conversation that a school would have to have really almost every year, right? Because
yes.
The population is going to change and you would have to course correct. You know, some years you might have to fill 10 seats, other years you need to improve your diversity.
Absolutely. So that this is a really central point to a lot of the work I do when I talk to schools about financial aid strategies, and also when I talk to boards about it too, because you're right. One year, your priorities just might change, and your needs will change from year to year. And many schools it doesn't. And even when it doesn't change, it's just as important to reaffirm that you're still, going after that goal. But yes, it's a conversation that has to happen every year. So before you spend that first dollar, it's got to be clear on which path you want it to help you want that dollar to help you walk down.
All right, let's talk about tuition revenue and affordability for a minute. So some of our listeners may be in schools that are talking about a commitment to affordability. And I'm curious what some of the trends around affordability are in the NAIS community. Can schools continue to charge the actual cost of their education?
Yeah. So some can and some can't. So we'll talk about. I'll get to that in a little bit. But one of the overall trends from an affordability standpoint that actually is encouraging to me is that, especially since the 2008 recession, which I know was over 10 years ago, it doesn't seem like it was that long ago, but we're actually seeing a real shift in more conservative tuition increases amongst independent schools, meaning that tuitions are still going up. Don't get me wrong, but they're going up at much slower rates than they used to, and that's good from an affordability standpoint. And so when I first arrived at NAIS, it was not uncommon to see 7, 8, 9% annual tuition increases, typically. But now we're seeing tuition increases more in the 3 to 4, maybe even 5% range. I've even seen schools in the 1.5 to 2.5% range even. But 3 to 4% seems to be more typical today than it was 10 or 15 years ago when it was more like 7, 8, or 9%. So that's good. The rate of growth is slowing at typical schools. And even before the pandemic, and pandemic has even the last year or so, we've seen a lot of schools even agree to halt tuition increases altogether or to sort of slow them down even more. And so it shows that many schools are rethinking how much they charge, how flexible they can afford to be with their tuition, because they know that they can't, that those trends of the past just are not as sustainable. I see we're also seeing more schools in the past, I would say 4 to 5 years or so, seeing more schools reset or drop their tuition prices. And along with like more schools doing things like tuition freezes, tuition guarantees. You know, you come in, we're middle school, you come in 6th grade, we guarantee the tuition won't change as long as you're in our middle school. We're seeing more things like that. More schools taking an actual intentional and strategic approach to tie tuition increases to the inflation rate. And so I think we're seeing there is a trend that schools are becoming more intentional about how they structure their tuition approaches. All those approaches are still kind of rare, like the freezes and the resets. Like it's not like that's a groundswell, but it is happening more than it used to. And more schools and more boards are talking about how to consider taking those kinds of steps and what kind of goes into making those decisions. I would say, though, you know, affordability is still being strained for a lot of families in a lot of markets. And so one of the things that's increasingly imperative for schools to do is to have a clearer sense of like what their external realities are, the communities from which they draw students, as far as like income change, income distribution. One of the things we ask schools to do all the time is calculate or determine what I call your affordability range, which is basically like if your tuition is whatever, pick a number, $25,000, do you know what kind of income a family needs to earn to be able to pay at least one $25,000 tuition? And let's say you determine or know that it takes, say, $180,000 to do that. Well, your affordability posture is different if you only have 3% of the families in your area actually earn that kind of money versus if you have 33% of the families in your area earn that kind of money. And what that says about your tuition price and your need to offset it, discount it, freeze it, drop it, it's important to know that element of reality in your tuition setting strategies. And so understanding not just the trends on how our prices are changing or how our expenses are changing that impact our price change, but also understanding the trends on how families' incomes in our markets are changing is really important to this affordability conversation as well. So those are some of the kind of like the high level trends. I think, one of the things that actually has happened in some of our strategy labs, some schools have come to our strategy lab looking at opportunities for generating new sources of new non-tuition revenue so that they can put lesser pressure on tuition growth and offset that with more sustainable and reliable income streams from non-tuition programs or projects or initiatives that generate some offset for that. And so I think things like that are ways that schools can really try to leverage their creativity and their innovation muscle to help with the affordability question, the affordability pressures that they might be feeling.
Are there any particular school programming revenue streams that have become really popular lately? Is there a particular strategy that people are trying right now?
Oh, that's a good question. I can't think of anything off the top of my head.
That's okay.
About that,
we'll cut that part out.
I can think of like a lot of stuff, but they're kind of like a lot of one-offs.
Yeah, that's okay. I was just curious.
Yeah. But it mostly centers around, like, a lot of schools are trying to leverage their physical plants for that. So whether it's like things like summer camps, we've had a couple schools especially try to take advantage of the pivoting that they had to do for around the pandemic, especially around online learning and distance learning, to turn that into not only like how do you leverage the distance learning that you're doing for your current students who need to work remotely, but then how do you use that to bring in or to target students or others who might want online education, who might not actually be a student of yours, right? So like, can I sign up a group of, I don't know, whatever, 8th graders who are just kind of, who just want to get, biochemistry or something because their school doesn't offer that. Well, guess what? We have an online program for that. We don't need to admit them or enroll them. We just register from them for this class and they can take it and we generate some revenue from that. So that was one of the interesting things we have seen, that some schools are trying to kind of leverage both their innovation capacity, their creativity around using education technology in a remote space to basically widen that net of who might we serve through these kinds of new programs that we're building already or building anyway. So we've seen a couple schools kind of walk down that path. It's been very interesting.
2020 was quite the year, and the economy was tumultuous, to say the least. It may be too early to tell, but are there any? Is there any data about how it has impacted enrollment in independent schools thus far?
Yeah, so we do have some early indicators of that, both from an enrollment standpoint and from a financial aid standpoint. From the enrollment standpoint, it's a little tricky. One of the things that when I worked in financial aid at Northwestern University, the financial aid director told me, Mark, she said, Mark, every financial aid question has the same answer. I said, okay, what is that? she said, the answer to every financial aid question is, it depends. And when it comes to sort of looking at the impact of 2020, the economy and the pandemic on enrollments, that answer actually applies quite starkly. It depends. It depends on the school. It depends on where they are. It depends on how families in that community sort of reacted or were impacted by COVID, both as a health issue and as an economic or a financial one. And so it's a little tricky to give a one-size-fits-all answer to that because, we're seeing impacts all across the spectrum. Like, it's forced some schools to close. Schools who are already vulnerable, maybe suffering a little bit on enrollment and had been chronically so. COVID pressures just kind of pushed too many families out to being able to re-enroll. Schools have to close. I wouldn't say that happened a lot, but it has happened to a number of schools. But on the other side of that, we've seen and heard stories of schools who have said they've got record enrollment. Their enrollment has never been higher. Their inquiry and applicant pipeline has never been deeper. And a lot of it has been driven by schools, independent schools' ability to deliver quality instruction during a time when parents felt like their public schools or whatever other school they were in just couldn't do it. And so a lot of schools saw this enrollment bump from COVID, where parents were like, oh, my school's doing X. I don't like how that's going to go. I don't think I'm going to like how that's going to go. So I'm going to look at this other option instead. And independent schools were often one of those other options in very many markets. And so a key challenge for an opportunity now is for a lot of those schools who have seen that bump to ensure that those families don't go back when their plan A kind of goes back to the mode that they were either expecting or were used to or were hoping for. And so schools should already be engaged in strategies and communications, with those families from a retention management perspective to be able to, that's different from what their typical re-enrollment efforts might be. Like if I know I got 10 kids who came here because of the COVID effect, the way I convince them to stay might be different or need to be different than the way I would convince somebody who would have most likely just re-enrolled anyway. And so I'm hoping that schools see that, that part of enrollment management portfolio is this retention piece, and how to manage your COVID bump from a retention standpoint should be dealt with a little differently than managing how you might typically manage re-enrollment in a quote unquote normal year. We have seen also, like in some big urban markets like New York City, San Francisco, where some independent schools lost enrollment because a lot of those families were moving out of those cities and out into the suburbs or the exurbs or rural areas where they thought the risk of COVID was going to be significantly lower. And especially if those families are expected to be schooling remotely, they figured, hey, we might as well do it in a place that we feel is safer or less risky than in the middle of the city. And so some of those families, pull their children out of an independent school and either set up their own sort of homeschooling pods or other sort of tutor-based kind of solutions. That again, I think for schools who have seen that kind of behavior, they need to figure out, think about, what's it going to take to kind of get that person feeling confident enough to come back to our school instead. So that's a couple of ways I think that COVID and the economy has affected the enrollments. From a financial aid perspective, it's been a little weird. It's the impact certainly that there's been some impact on financial aid demand based on COVID, but not nearly the kind of impact that we saw after the Great Recession in 2008. I think that 2008 recession and the way that schools had to increase financial aid to meet the new demand from that was a lesson that they learned and try to anticipate what might happen this time around with similar economic strain. But that economic strain hasn't affected independent school families quite the same way. And so we are seeing that, there's some increase in financial aid applications, but not that much. Not that much more than what would happen in a typical year. One of the things we know that about a little more than half, about 55% of schools actually set up emergency financial aid funds for families that were experiencing some COVID economic impacts. But as of like October, we did the snapshot survey at NEIS, and at that point, only about 22% of the schools actually told us that they had spent all the money from those funds. And so most of the schools, and about 30 to 35% said that they had spent very little or none of those funds. And so, so the demand for new financial aid from those families wasn't as severe, I think, as what schools were anticipating, which in one way of speaking and thinking is good news. But there's one thing about that, what's different that's somewhat alarming. And this is happening in the higher ed space too, which is applications for financial aid from the lowest earning families is actually dropping. I know in the SSS program, for example, there's a fee waiver program. So if your family earns less than a certain, amount of money in the threshold, then the fee for applying for financial aid gets waived, right? And so one of the things that we try to track is how many families who apply for aid, meet these conditions. And last data I saw, I think it was through December, the percentage of families who are applying for financial aid who would qualify for those fee waivers is down like 25 to 30%. And so for some reason, the lowest income earning families are becoming less represented in the aid pool. And part of me wonders if, we know that from the economic effects of COVID really hit the most vulnerable populations the hardest, service workers, hospitality workers, et cetera, who are generally speaking lower income earners. And so if those families are experiencing this kind of, some of the harshest effects of the COVID economic impacts, to what degree is that keeping them from even seeing independent schools as an option? Or maybe they're just postponing or saying, not this year, we can't even think about that right now. Or one of the things that seems to be happening, or that people are worried about is happening in higher ed, is that as families who are applying for federal aid in the higher ed space, that applications are dropping as well in many states. And so one of the fears or anxieties is that may be happening because the lower income families are losing, because their schools are remote, they're losing access to counselors and teachers and others who would actually do a lot of work to spur them to seek college or to fill out forms and to do things, according to deadlines and all that stuff. And so especially with new students, I wonder/worry if something similar is happening in the independent school side too, because a lot of the lower income families often referred to independent schools by special programs like, Prep for Prep or A Better Chance, or from counselors in the public schools or the schools where they are attending. And if they are losing access and touch points to folks who can actually counsel them and spur them and guide them and advise them on applying for aid in certain timeframes, that if losing those touch points might mean that they're dropping out of the pool altogether. I don't know if that's true. But it's something I wonder and worry about, because that is where we're seeing almost like a counterintuitive effect that the COVID economy impacts has led to fewer people applying for financial aid, especially in the lower income, higher need families.
It sounds like a wonderful problem to take to the strategy lab to figure out a way to reach out to students who have, lost the support network that would be helping them maybe get funneled into independent schools.
Absolutely. One of the images we use in Strategy Lab is of the boulder. And so we usually call, like, if you come with a big challenge, to come to Strategy Lab with a big challenge, we call that big challenge your boulder. And the whole goal of Strategy Lab is to break down that big boulder into smaller rocks that you can pick up and do something with. And that is definitely a big boulder. The lower, and this is something that's actually been happening over time. And I think the COVID experiences, like with many other areas, has exacerbated it, which is sort of like this eroding proportion of lower income students in the applicant pool, and certainly fewer actually even in the financial aid applicant and financial aid recipient pools. And so sort of like this big boulder is like, are we squeezing out the lower income families more than we thought we were squeezing out the middle income families, right? And like, what are some of the things we can do to tackle that and break that boulder down into smaller actions that we can take to kind of reverse that trend? Because that is a trend that we've been seeing for a long time, 10, 15 years in our schools.
I have one more follow-up question for you. I'm curious, you mentioned the COVID bump in enrollment. Have you read any, credible hypotheses on what percentage of that bump might remain post-COVID?
No, I think it's all speculation. No,
that's okay.
The answer to the actual question is no. I have not read or seen anything that tries to predict that.
That's all right. I haven't either. It's something I've been wondering about.
It's a good question, though.
The school I'm at has seen a huge bump, I think everyone's kind of asking that question, because surely it's going to have some positive impact. I mean, more people have been introduced to many independent schools and have had great experiences. But I'm curious, what it'll look like.
So the answer to that question sort of reminds me, I should say, my take on that question reminds me of one of my favorite quotes. I can't remember. It's a cliche now. I can't remember who said it, but it's the best way to create the best way to predict the future is to create it. Right. And so sort of like, don't worry about what people might be predicting about what percentage might remain. That's your job, right? You have to, maybe you start by saying, not you, Mike, but you know what I mean? Like you as a school, you start by saying, we want 75% of these people to remain. What will it take to have that happen, right? We want 50%, whatever. Put a stake in the ground, get some people around the table and think through, why might they not come back? What do we know about what their experience has been that might force them to go back to plan A that they were in before? And what can we do to counteract that, right? And so I would say, man, make your own prediction.
I love it. Create the future.
Put some
strategic
behind how to move that needle yourself.
Wonderful. All right, here's our last themed question here. So talk just for a moment to the aspiring leaders out there. Maybe you're not, maybe there's a leader out there who doesn't work specifically in admissions. What would you say the key things for someone to be mindful about are with respect to enrollment management right now?
Yeah. So I mentioned this earlier. I would say I think it's really key for an aspiring leader in a school to understand why a parent comes to your school in the first place. What are they hoping to achieve by enrolling their child or their children in your school? So a good place to start, I touched on this earlier, is the NAIS Jobs to Be Done research that we did a couple years back. That really exposed that, amongst independent school parents at large, that there are about 4 stories or 4 contexts that tend to be at play when a parent decides, I want to take my child out of the school they're currently in and put them into the independent school that I picked. And there are 4 main stories around that. And if the better you're able to be clear about which of those stories is most present or most prevalent in your school, that tells you what was motivating that family to enroll in your school. And it helps you have it helps provide some additional clarity around how you message what your school is about, how you align your program, your curriculum, your co-curricular activities around what those motivations and those desired outcomes of families are. It helps you shape your community building efforts. And it can be it can really be an enlightening way to think about who you serve and how you can be relevant and resonant moving forward. So I don't know how much time we have to go through each of those 4 stories in the podcast, but there's a lot of info on the NAIS website about this, NAIS Jobs to Be Done research. And how it can be applicable to enrollment management tactics, fundraising and communication strategies in a lot of different areas. And so I would say, ground yourself in a better understanding of the parent's perspective of what's motivating them to be in your independent school, and try to center around that in all areas of school operations and school functions. So the 4 jobs that we discovered in the NAIS, and I'm going to shorthand them. Of course, folks can go to the website to get more of the details. Well, job number 1, and these are in no particular order, just the order they're coming to the top of my head. So job number 1 is my child is really having a very acute struggle in their current school, and I need a school to solve that problem for me. An acute struggle, in the context that we heard those, tended to be around either learning differences or social and emotional distress, right? So things like being bullied come up in this kind of category, or this is where we tend to find a lot of those struggles that students are having, again, based on their learning differences. And they're just not being successful. And the parents are worried that if I keep my child in this school, they're going to hate going to school. They're not going to like, in the end, they're not learning anything. And so I need to take care of this like right away. And so they look for an independent school to help solve that. They're motivated by, help me find a school that's going to solve this problem that my child is facing right now. So some number of families seek independent schools out for that very specific kind of context. A second context that we heard a lot was, my child, is fine, academically okay, but I'm just worried that they're not being pushed to their potential, that there's something about the school that they're in that's creating too much distraction, or they're hanging around kids who don't have the same kind of goals or the same kind of values that I want my child to kind of be immersed or to be around. And so I'm looking for a school that's going to really help my child fulfill his or her potential around other people who share similar values like mine, right? And so when I think about this job, I often think of myself, that I know when I think back to when I went to independent schools, because I went to independent schools for high school, independent school for high school only. So coming up through 8th grade, I know my mom was concerned about sending me to the local public high school, because that high school had this tremendously bad reputation for high dropout rates, drug use, gang activity, violence, all this kind of stuff. And it was just like, no, I don't want my son to be in that environment, because I know he has potential that I don't want to get lost or squandered, et cetera. And so job 2 is really more about that. Help me find a school that's going to help my child kind of like stay challenged, fulfill their potential around other kids, where it's okay to be like geeky and smart, or it's okay to be, and so it's sort of like that. So a lot of families pick independent schools for that lane. A third lane is, the school that my child is in is just too focused on teaching to the test. All I really care about is whether or not my child sort of like gets a certain score or on a state-based whatever. And they're really not attending at all to the social, emotional learning side of things. Like they drop the arts program. They no longer do theater or music, because that stuff's not on the standardized testing. And so they're really looking for schools that will help them make sure that their child is more well-rounded, exposed to kids and opportunities exposed to kids from diverse backgrounds, exposed to opportunities to see things outside their own sort of comfort zone. And so families families in this job 3 lane are like more interested in community service and service learning programs, foreign exchange opportunities. One family we talked to, the guy was really funny. He told his son, that, if you go to this school and you get all A's, that means you're not doing it right. He was like, and someone's like, what are you talking about? He said, because man, you got this opportunity to school to like get involved in these clubs and to go abroad to do blah, blah, blah. But it's okay to get a B if it's because you spend more time doing other things besides just in your
I love that
dorm room studying all the time. Yeah. And so job 3 parents is all about that well-rounded global citizen, not just academics. And then job 4 is families or parents who feel as though their child has a really strong set of skills in something, strongly talented. It could be sports, music, could be math and science, but they're strongly talented in something. And the current school they're in is not pushing them hard enough to exploit that talent, or they're not paying attention enough to my child to grow that talent in order for them to take the next leap forward at their next level of education. So it's almost like the parents see something super special about their child, and the parent has a plan for what that child can do moving forward, whether it's, be a Division I volleyball player or first chair flautist in some orchestra or whatever it might be. But it's like, I'm hiring your school because I believe you can help me fulfill this plan and not squander the greatness of my child. So there are a lot of families that choose independent schools for that reason. And so those are kind of like the 4 jobs. So the idea is that if I know that I have, some preponderance of families at my school are aligned in this job 3 mode, this global citizen, well-rounded, then the things that they come to me for, if they find that those things aren't there, or they find that they're lacking, or they find that I may be oversold what that actually looked like when they decided to enroll, then that's going to create more dissatisfaction. And so, but if I'm able to sort of double down on, guess what? Like 75% of the families here are in that job 3. So let's just make sure that, we just double down on delivering on things that encourage and support and extend that job 3 outcome. Some schools, but if you're in job 1, the things you do for children and for families and for parents are just going to be different than the things that you highlight or focus or do than if you think you're serving more job 2 or job 3. And so sometimes schools get challenged by thinking, right, that they may be a job 4 kind of school. And they kind of tout themselves as like, you can come here. Here are the great Ivy League schools all of our graduates go to. But if a family comes to them because they really just want them to help the child get better at managing their dyslexia, talking about what Ivy League school they're likely to go to is not going to be the thing that's going to be most resonant. And so a lot of times there can be these disconnects, both in terms of the way a school talks about itself or the programs it offers or things they decide to add or cut that can be inconsistent with the job that the parent is expecting when they came. And so I would say having a mindset, we call that demand side thinking in Strategy Lab, having that demand side lens on how do we actually how do we actually know what jobs parents are actually hiring us to do of those 4, and how can we better intentionally align our activities, communications, and programs, et cetera, with that job in mind, so that we increase satisfaction, increase demand amongst others who have that similar context and can more easily see themselves as a member of our community when they know we are aligned to solve what they're trying to accomplish.
I'm really glad you shared that. That's incredible advice. And we'll have to talk as we get to the end how we can link that. The jobs to be done.
NAS jobs to be done. Yeah.
Well, we end our podcast by asking all of our guests the following 3 questions, Mark. What should people be reading? What should people be listening to? And how can people connect with you?
All right. Yeah. So what should people be reading? I was thinking about an NAIS publication that I would suggest, especially aspiring heads and new heads, to make sure they read, which is the Independent School Magazine. And one of the things that I think, one of the reasons why this came to my mind was because the last 3 issues in particular, I thought were just like, man, this is the kind of stuff that if school leaders aren't already kind of honed in on, like these issues can help them shape some of their thinking around this or some perspectives. So like the last 3 issues, for example, like the Winter magazine was all about conversations about schools and systemic racism and conversations about race and how to manage those conversations within schools. The fall issue this past year was around community health and well-being, right? And the summer issue was around crisis leadership. And so it's like, how timely and critical are all those discussions right now, right? And I was just thinking, like, what new or aspiring leaders shouldn't be forming ways of thinking or ways of being around those kinds of topics right now? So the magazine is a great way to start, and to stay abreast of like their peers and their colleagues' views, some examples. Like there's a lot of examples like what schools are doing in all these regards. and a lot of perspectives that people share about that. So I would say read the Independent School magazine if you don't already. What should people be listening to? So, I'll share both a personal and a sort of a professional reflection on this. Like,
great.
I grew up in the 80s, right? Like I went to high school and college in the 80s. So I love 80s music, for better or for worse. That's just like where my musical comfort zone is.
Yeah, sure.
And so one of the things I'm like digging these days is listening to Spotify playlists of remakes of 80s songs.
Oh,
right?
cool.
And so I'm just trying to find like who's done these like cool twists on a song like Michael Jackson's Smooth Criminal, right? Or remember that Run DMC rap song, You Be Illin'? Like I found like these like really cool versions of those songs that kind of bring them up to date in interesting ways. So that's one thing I'd say, whatever decade you were in high school or college, like find like some remakes. It'll just lift your spirits and change your way of thinking about some things. From a personal standpoint, I would say I would give another NAIS resource. It's a podcast called The Trustee Table. And so even though, new and aspiring leaders are not trustees, listening to that Trustee Table podcast is a good way to kind of get a sense on what like subject matter experts are saying about different aspects of governance and school leadership, that from a school leader's perspective, it would be interesting just to kind of know, actually the most recent podcast in January was around enrollment management trends. Like how should trustees be thinking about these enrollment management trends? There was one a couple times before that, a couple episodes before that was around tuition resets. If your board is thinking about rethinking and innovating around tuition, listen to this podcast to hear some of the things we've learned from our research around schools who've done those resets. And so I think that Trustee Table podcast will be a good way for a school leader to kind of peer into what are trustees being told to pay attention to, and how does that inform their own reflections on what leadership looks like, and how to prepare for working with boards on those very same issues. So I would say, Trustee Table podcast would be a good professional listen. And then to get in touch with me, the best way is simply by email. My email is Mitchell, MITCHELL @NAIS.org. I look forward to hearing from anybody with questions, or just want to kind of have more conversations about any and all of the stuff that we talked about today. So thanks.
Thanks so much, Mark, for being with us today. This has been incredibly educating. I've learned a lot, and I'm sure our listeners are really, really grateful also that you took the time to speak with us today. Thank you so much.
My pleasure.
Thank you for listening to the Full Stack Educator Podcast. We hope that today's conversation helped you grow as an independent school leader. Be sure to check out our show notes for links to resources mentioned in the podcast. If you enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe, rate it, leave a review, and share it with a friend. Episodes of this podcast are released bi-weekly. You can follow and engage with Matt McGee and Michael Amusio on LinkedIn.